Hi, my name is Tony Mashuk. The following presentation is an analysis on the complexities of race and whiteness. So, this is essentially a breakdown of how race exists in the world as a complex phenomenon. So, I'll be examining here some of the components involved with race, such as its layers and intersections and some of the complications, in a sort of holistic way. So, before I get into it, it's important in decolonization discourses that we discuss who we are and where we come from and our positionality. So, this is to name essentially how we came to be on the lands that we're on, where our knowledges are coming from, and what sort of histories or identities we may be carrying with us in these discussions. So, for myself, I'm of an academic background. So, I have a degree in anthropology, and I also have studied Indigenous studies and peace and conflict studies as well. And I specialized in race and globalization in my studies quite a bit. And I feel as though my academic background has kind of positioned me to see race in a very interrelational type of way that emphasizes culture and society in particular, but also biology as well. With regards to where I'm from, I was born and raised in Alberta. I'm currently living in rural Alberta on the traditional lands of the Niitsitapi Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina Sarsi, and Yahe Nakota Stoney Nations. And in terms of my own heritage, I'm of Ukrainian refugee descent. So my paternal grandparents were persecuted as slave laborers during the Holocaust. And yeah, it's actually a relatively little known fact that Slavs were in fact racially persecuted in the Holocaust. It's part of this whole Lebensraum ideology and Nazism that was actually inspired by colonization of indigenous peoples in Africa and North America. But anyways, my grandparents were unable to return back to Ukraine because their land had been occupied by the Soviets, and some of my family was being persecuted. So they were sort of forced to come to Canada as refugees. Though on my mother's side of the family, it's a bit of a mix. So I have first wave Ukrainian ancestors, Swiss Mennonite ancestors, sort of British Isles, mix of British Isles ancestors, Anglo Celt kind of thing, and Cree Métis from the Red River Settlement in Saskatchewan. So another part of decolonization, in particular, decolonizing whiteness, is to work to reclaim and to sustain and reconcile our ancestral identities that may have been lost over time. So, so for myself, I'm working to sustain and expand on my Ukrainian upbringing that I was raised with to an extent. So I'm working to learn my language actually, and learn about my history and culture and those things. At the same time, I'm also reconnecting with my indigenous roots, my Cree Métis roots that I wasn't raised with, but were lost through some process of assimilation and estrangement and such over the years. And so that's proving to be quite a process as well. So one other thing I wanted to say, in regards to my background, I was essentially raised as and socialized into whiteness, and I've had the lived experience of a white person. With that said, though, there are times where I feel as though my identity gets a little bit complicated, just given what my grandparents went through and how I'm reconciling my indigenous background. So the significance of this is that you'll see that in this presentation, there's sort of a recurring theme around that, around this as a complication in race, that we don't all necessarily fit into race all quite the same way. So yeah, I wanted to discuss as well the purpose of this presentation in kind of greater depth. So the whole premise of this is more analytical than it is directive. It's not so much, the point of this is not to say, okay, this is what we have to do. It's more of, this is how we can understand race and racism and whiteness. So we're doing is we're examining how race and racism exists in the world in a multidimensional way. Ultimately, it's not, when I say multidimensional, I don't mean that in the way of saying like it's an analysis of intersectionality per se, but more studying the intersections within race and racism, like the components uh, that comprise race and how they interact and how they change and affect the entire structure and complexity of race. With that said, though, it's also important that we remember that race is intersectional to other forms of inequality and does overlap with, say, gender and ability and class and sexuality and all these types of things. That can also be a way in which race can be experienced in those ways as well, and racism can actually become a medium through those things. However, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on that because those are not components of race. They're sort of parallel and lateral to race, like they're related as structures of inequality that interact with race, but they're not part of race. And so I'm just studying here what makes up race ultimately. So a major theme here is that when we try to understand race, that we think about it as deeply and holistically and critically as possible, especially so as to avoid any oversimplification that can lead to misunderstanding. That leads me to this point, the problem with oversimplification. Now, given that race is a very complex structure, and especially in sort of collective discourses that are entangled with semantics, right? It's really easy to turn complex phenomena into reductionism. So to take something really complicated and boil it down to something really small. So this kind of happens when we make race monolithic. So, for example, race is only about skin color. Like, I'm sure we've heard that before, right? That whenever there's a discussion on race, it's like it's turned into, well, this is your skin color and that's my skin color. And, skin color is definitely an aspect of race. It's definitely a component, but it's much more than that, obviously. Same thing as, saying race is only about discrimination, right? We know that racism happens in more ways than just discrimination or just racist people, right? Like, is racism just a matter of racist people in the world? Well, no, there's also a racist system and a racist culture and a racist society, and everything in our society has some form of racist embodiment in it. And so another thing could be all people of color experience the same things, right? Another kind of reductionism. Well, we know that not all people of color fit into racialization the same way. They're not all racialized the same way. They have different histories, different ways of being an other, and different positionalities that change their experience. And likewise, the statement only white people can be racist, like in some ways that's actually true, right? But in another way, it's also reductionism because it's assuming that, again, the positionality of people of color is all the same. And we know that that's not necessarily true. That let's just say you have, Indian immigrants come to Canada and they're on stolen indigenous land, and let's just say that they, take on the anti-indigenous sort of attitudes in Canada. Well, that's kind of upholding racism in a way, right? And that also shows how the positionality is different between those two groups as well, right? So it's just not as simple as only white people can be racist. I think it's true that people of color can't be racist to white people, the power group, but within people of color, there's all sorts of different power dynamics involved in some ways. As well, race is not binary in nature. So I noticed that it's really easy to turn race into binary. So to say, white versus person of color. And I know that we have to use those terms sometimes because we're discussing a power relationship, and the simplest way to try to understand that is, white is a power group, people of color is the powerless group, and in a lot of ways that makes sense, but it's not always that clear cut though, right? Like, we know that white and people of color they're not scientific or biological categories, right? These are constructed categories because race is a social cultural construct, right? That, whiteness is not biological. It's a made up idea and everything else. And so is racialization. So in that sense, because it's not scientific, it's impossible to actually quantify who exactly is white and who exactly is a person of color. And so there's times where there's some ambiguity that comes up between that, and where there's people who exist sort of in the middle. for example, Jews or Arabs or Turks, other groups like that, or mixed race people who might have both experiences. And there's all kinds of examples, right? But just saying that when we understand it, we try to keep those things in mind. Likewise, indigenous versus settler, that's another binary that can be problematic, right? And again, it's easy to try to think of it that way when we're looking at who's occupying what land and such. But if we dig deeper, it can be problematic to look at it that way, because not everyone is either indigenous or settler, right? Some peoples most certainly fall outside that binary. If you look at Black people who are descended from slaves, they certainly did not settle here. They were taken by force, and are actually indigenous people who are displaced from their land, right? So, or refugees who had to leave their land due to, in some cases, colonization, right? So it's not as simple as indigenous settler and everyone on this side has the same positionality and everyone on that side has the same positionality. It's just not that simple. So same could go for individual versus collective. That's another binary, right? That it's either on the individual scale or it's on the collective scale. And those things can merge all the time. Racism exists on both of those and in the middle, and they interact all the time. And you know what I mean? So it's not one or the other. The same thing with local global. Racism isn't just, a matter of here versus there, or the world and where I live. It's both of those things. Racism at the local level is in large part governed by racism at the global level, and it's upheld at the local level. So they kind of feed into each other. You know what I mean? Or I threw this one in kind of just as another example, like passing versus non-passing. So passing as white, for example. What does that mean? Well, passing isn't so simple as just what you look like necessarily. Passing could also be like someone might pass differently in different contexts, right? So depending on what your religion is or your language or how you act, or like there's all sorts of things like that, right? Different contexts, people might read you differently, and so you might face different experiences depending on that. Or this is an important one: racist versus non-racist or anti-racist. What does that mean? Are you either a racist or you're an anti-racist, or you're either a racist or a non-racist? What does that mean? Well, that depends on how we define racism and how we understand racism to exist in the world, right? Like what does it mean to be a racist person? And we know that racism exists in all these different ways, so it's really not as simple as either you're racist or you're not. I would argue, even if you're anti-racist, you could very well still have some degree of racist conditioning. And so to what extent is that possible? All those are important questions. Same goes for privileged or unprivileged, right? Is it really so simple that you're either privileged or you're not? Even within race, like intersectionally, that's especially true. But even just within race, being privileged or unprivileged is totally variable. It depends on so many different factors and different layers of race, of how race exists in the world, that it's really just more complex than that. So another part of the context here is where race came from, the origins of race. And so I've had some people tell me that, race has always been around. It's part of human nature, or that it's been here since ancient times. And that's just not true. Like, humans have noticed physical and cultural and linguistic or ethnical differences since the beginning of time. That's definitely true. I mean, people are going to notice those things. But race as a construct, race as a structure, race as that categorizes people in this sort of pseudo-scientific way that has created all this power and inequality, that hasn't existed until really quite recently in human history. So it came really out of globalization. And so, just in a nutshell, what globalization is essentially, we think of the modern so-called world today, where we have, countries and international markets and politics and all this stuff that we understand to be the contemporary world. Ultimately, that originates with European imperialism back in the day that had spread European civilization around the world. And then we're just simply upholding it today. So that all began back in the European Renaissance with the times of Columbus and European expansionism and the search for wealth and trade and land and resources and those things. And so with imperialism, right, the intention to essentially grow an empire and annex more territory, colonialism naturally came about. And because there were already people living in the places where the Western world was trying to expand into, genocide and slavery and displacement became concomitant outcomes. And in this, European empires had established nation states in these stolen territories. So if you think about it, pretty much every nation state, every country that you can, almost every country in the world traces back somehow to European imperialism. Every single country was either established by European powers or it was indirectly established by European powers under European influences. So that's what I mean by globalization in the modern world, so to speak, is the idea that we're living in this type of society today, this global society, global interconnectedness. It all traces back to European imperialism, and that includes global markets, global politics. We all have the same, centralized government systems, and even religion and language as well. So there's quite a few things. So when Western Europeans were expanding around the world through imperialism, they encountered the other, right? And peoples who they marked as different from themselves, who had physical differences from themselves and cultural differences and all kinds of differences. This was in some ways sort of new to the Europeans, but more than it just being, a peculiar thing, it actually became the premise of race, right? Noticing these differences. It wasn't so much just the fact they were different. It was that it was turned into a construct of power, in fact. So the idea that racial categories exist, or that peoples can be classified into racial categories, it's called racialism. And that's essentially where racism came originally from, was from the idea of classifying human beings into these purported scientific categories. And this emerged with the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. So the earliest categorizations or conceptualizations of race are in the 1600s, late 1600s, in Western Europe. Countries like France and Germany and Sweden and countries like that. And most importantly, like I said, racial differences were not just seen as peculiar things to study. It was created as so to justify the exploitation of the other, right? And to delineate some groups as superior and others as inferior. And of course, these systems were created by powerful, privileged white men who put themselves in the superior category, of course, because that was the whole purpose of this. It was not meant to be scientific, really. I think it was really, it was pseudoscientific, but they kind of claimed it to be a scientific observation, but it was actually driven by all these other ideological intentions. And notably as well, race was born together with other forms of inequality. When race was being developed as a construct, alongside it were other forms of inequality that were either being perpetuated from an earlier time, or other forms of inequality were being actually created, like eugenics and social Darwinism and those things, which are actually quite connected with race. But also treatment of disabled people and those types of things also came about with race and perpetuating inequality of gender inequality and those types of things as well. Very importantly, to where race comes from is the idea of progress and civilization. Okay, this is like the ideological driving force behind racism, and I often say that ethnocentrism is a building block of racism, because ethnocentrism is the idea that one's culture is superior to other cultures. And the idea of progress and civilization is that, there's some cultures that are less developed and less modern than we are, and we're more developed than they are, we're more evolved than them, It could be in a physical way, or it could be in a cultural or societal way, but most particularly in the latter, that was connected to race. And so, the sort of savagery, barbarism, civilization that early anthropologists came up with. So yeah, that drove a lot of, basically is the driving force of racism. So with all that said, race is a cultural construct embedded everywhere in the globalizing world. And I say globalizing world because the world isn't really globalized yet. Globalization is an ongoing process, right? The globalization of European civilization and European cultural structures, that's what they are, they're cultural structures. That is ongoing and it's intensifying. In fact, by definition, globalization means the ever intensification of that. And it's the same with colonization and imperialism. Those are ongoing processes as well. They're not frozen in time. They're continuing, and we're actually upholding it with this society. But race is a cultural construct because it's not biological, really. It's not scientific. There's a biological component, but it's not biologically scientific. It's constructed. It's arbitrary. The categories are arbitrary. They've been drummed up with all sorts of criteria that are not objective or ontological. Really, they're created for the purposes of ideology. Okay, and anyone who challenges this, I will ask you to find where the white race begins and ends. Like, where's the magic line that separates it from other races? When you actually look for it, you can't find it because it's based on all sorts of arbitrary criteria that people have argued about where the line is and can't actually find it because it's not actually real. But yeah, because our society as we know it today has been founded in these cultural structures that originated with racism and European colonialism and such, and globalization, that we can't separate our society today from that. And that the historical legacies are living on everywhere in these structures today. And that race has become omnipresent. It's baked into the structure of our society. And for that reason, you could say that our society is inherently racist and always will be. So to illustrate how race functions, I created a sort of sequence here to show the relationships underlying race. So racism is about power. Okay, power entails inequality. So for power to be actualized, it requires dividing people into superior and inferior groups. Inequality is determined by hegemony, and so in other words, inequality can't materialize until there's domination. Hegemony requires alienation, so seeing people as other or as alien. And then alienation becomes exploitation. So we've essentially seen this kind of relationship, these are sort of steps in that relationship, steps as the functions, in race since the very beginnings of race. That racism has sort of been upheld at these multiple levels as a power structure with these sort of steps. That racism has always been about exploitation at the end of the day. And there's always been some element of othering and some element of domination and categorization as into superior and inferior groups. And this all upholds power altogether. And so how does this inequality manifest? Well, essentially across multiple layers and aspects. And I've already mentioned some of this already, but I'm going to go through actually several layers of race or major layers of race. And that would be physical and cultural and geographic, historical and societal layers. And so a major theme here as well is that we'll see going through each of these layers that there's always some element of othering, of ethnocentrism and historical legacies that are major building blocks to race and racism. And each of these elements fit into each layer in their own way. So the first and perhaps most basic layer of race to examine would be the physical layer. And I think this is because it's always the most marked and the most visible, and it's also kind of the original aspect of race. That in the original historical racial constructionism, the physical aspects were the first aspect. They decided to classify people based on physical traits. And so this led to that racial hierarchy of distinguishing superiority and such. But more importantly, today we are living with the legacy of those historical racial classifications that live on today in our discourses that have led to today's inequality. That if those historical racial constructions never existed, we wouldn't have inequality today. So there's definitely a historical legacy involved. And as well, objectification of the body is a major component here. When I was in university, I studied Michel Foucault, who would say that discourses, so how we understand things, our epistemology, how we talk about things, that discourses actually allow for inequality and allow for upholding power. That he would argue that the inequality, racial inequality today, wouldn't be possible without the discourses of racial categories. It wouldn't be possible without the objectification of the body into categorization. That if that never happened, we wouldn't have inequality today. That whiteness and racialization depends on discourses and us upholding those discourses, which upholds the inequality. Now, it's not as simple as just saying, well, let's just not use the categories, because, of course, inequality is already built into the structure. So we kind of have to see those things as connected at the same time. But it's the point that the categories actually enable objectification and exploitation, and that it enforces power by directing action. So by putting people into certain categories and upholding those categories, it influences the direction of action that people can take, and that there's a sort of power involved with that. Not to mention biopolitics and the erasure of personhood and dehumanization and those things as well. So as well, scientific racism, eugenics, social Darwinism, those types of things as well are rooted in historical legacies that still have their effect today and are rooted in objectification and those things as well. Now, so what things actually mark the physical? What sort of things actually make up this physical layer? So physical traits, of course, skin color, eye color, hair color, skull shape, those types of things have been used to categorize people. And those things mark people as either racial other or as white. And from that categorization and that idea involved comes racial perception. How are you perceived? Based on what you look like, how people understand what you look like. What does that mean? How do you walk in the world and are experience and are having a certain racial experience based on what you look like? There's a lived experience involved, right? And there's treatment based on perception. So discrimination and privileging happens based on what you look like. There's this lived experience, and for each one of these layers, I'm going to talk about a type of other for each layer. So in this sense, there's the physical and phenotypical other. So the physical aspect of race and being an other is that racialized peoples are seen as physically other, as phenotypically other, right? And I put two here because the physical also includes genetic or other biological components, more of a biological other, such as that which was used in say Nazi racial ideology. And there's also the phenotypical aspect. So physically saying, those people who look like that, they're not us, right? They're separate from us. They're the other, right? And so also on the physical layer comes a physical racial identity that implicates one's experience in race, as the identity you actually carry with you as a white person or a racialized person that, again, is going to intersect and interact with other components of race. But this is definitely one component. So I wanted to give some examples on where the physical layer of race gets complicated. So mixed race individuals are a really good example, because the physical layer can get variable here, right? Mixed race people can be perceived as racially or physically or phenotypically other, right? Or they can be perceived as white, and that can happen with passing as white or white passing privilege, and this can complicate their racial identity, right? It can make their positionality more complex, and their racial experience more complex because they may be racialized in other ways, but in terms of the physical sense, are experiencing whiteness. And even that can be variable because, like I said in my other slides, passing isn't binary, right? Other things like your culture, for example, can influence how you pass or how you talk or all those things as well. So even the idea of white passing person of color, in a sense, is oxymoronic because person of color suggests color, and white passing is sort of the absence of that color. So what it really means, though, is that people who are racialized but have a white, to some extent or another, white racial experience in a physical way, are to some measure or another living in partial whiteness. Not because they're white necessarily, but because they're living in partial whiteness. They may have they're racialized in other ways, but in the physical layer of things, they are experiencing a white experience in that particular dimension. So this can also happen on the group level as well. So mixed race or non-Western or racially ambiguous groups may also be othered in ways that are beyond the physical layer, but may at times have a white physical experience. So Jews, Arabs, Slavs, Turks, etc. They may appear white, but they actually have a more complicated racial experience in other ways, right? And so this also helps to break down the whole white versus person of color binary, and that we can see that race is more complex than just looking a particular way. And so, yeah, the conclusion here is that the physical aspects are one component of race and racism. It's not the entire thing. We can't reduce race into this monolith of just the physical experience. There's just too many other components involved that I'm going to get into, but there's definitely intersection with other layers that determine overall racial experience and positionality. Another layer of race would be that of culture, language, and religion. And in this sense, culture, language, and religion can be markers of one's racialization. So in the sense of being the cultural other, right, as opposed to the physical or phenotypical other, you can be the cultural other. Your culture is other. You're experienced as an other through your culture. You experience racism through cultural supremacy. And this also is true through language and religion. You can be a linguistic other and a religious other as well, that those things can mark your racialization and experience racism through those things. For example, in language, it could be having a foreign accent. It could be speaking dialects of English, like African American English, that mark you as a racial other, right? Or your religion, such as being a Muslim or being a Jew, those types of things. So it's more than just the physical, and as well, this goes back to progress in civilization. The idea of being more civilized and being more progressed and more modern and all these things, and that ethnocentrism of cultural supremacy, right? Because we know that race isn't just about the physical; it's also about this sort of social aspect as well. Orientalism, in particular, the idea that non-European, especially Eastern or Asian cultures, being barbaric and backwards and these types of things. It's all a cultural sort of. It's all using culture as a tool of racism, essentially. And with this comes cultural repression. So suppressing other cultures, dominating other cultures, causing for assimilation into the dominant culture. And this is very true, especially since we see that European cultural structures through globalization have globalized. And assimilation has an effect on one's identity and their social positionality, that this actually can change the way that they're positioned. It can sort of whiten your social positionality in a certain sense, but it also can be detrimental to that person in the sense that now they've had to lose their identity in that sense. So I also wanted to throw in here that culture is also how we act, speak, move, and embody. It's not as simple as just cultural practices that are particular to ethnic groups. Culture is also right down to the micro level of literally body movements and speech patterns and these types of things as well that can be aspects of one's ethnic identity as well that we might not be as conscious of that, but actually those things can mark people as the other as well. So um, it does get quite complex. And so I wanted to give some examples of how racism can be experienced through culture, language, or religion, and where it can get kind of complicated. So, for example, I've heard the idea that Islam is not a race, right? And therefore, saying I don't like Muslims, or Muslims shouldn't be here, or whatever, is not a form of racism. But it actually is a form of racism because, well, it's true that Islam's not a race. It's also true that Muslims are most often not white and not European, and that to see Muslims in this way is a sort of othering of them, and using their religion and their culture that comes along with that, and very often their language as well, which is often Arabic, right? It's a way of othering those people and racializing them through their religion and through their culture and through their language, because again, the physical component of racism, being brown and being from the Middle East, that is also connected with their religion and with their culture. So you can't separate the religion out and say it's not a race. That's just simply fallacious. And yeah, it's because they're seen as Oriental and they're seen as other. And this goes the same thing goes for other non-Western religions as well. Even Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, many different religions can be seen this way, and the same could be said for languages as well. So the next layer would be the geographical layer. And of course, this connects in with the other layers. All the layers here are connected ultimately. But geography is actually a very important aspect of race that I think can get overlooked quite easily. Especially when we consider the globality of racism today. So, first of all, racial categories are linked to geographical origin. This is how the first racial categories were developed. It wasn't just skin color and these types of things. It was also the geographical location of where people were from, right? Like drawing a line and separating where people are considered an other, right? And in this sense, you can be considered the geographical other, and even terms like the Near East, for example, is an othering type of term because it's where's the East near to? It's near to Europe. It's Eurocentric, right? And Eurocentrism largely ties into this geographical layer, and centering the sort of first world or the global north. These are all aspects of geography, and so. In this sense, groups can be experienced on the basis of geography being the geographical other, right? So in that sense. And here, local and global contexts are at play in globalization. So in geography, this can be racism at the local level, or it can be at the global level, right? And like I said before, racism is often governed at a global level, and upheld at the local level. But there's also variations in these things as well. So this goes quite broad, really. Local to global, that could be interconnected systems of economics around the world that privilege certain groups, or just the kind of global apartheid of economic and political inequality around the world. That's local and global, definitely. And the embodiment of different histories, quite a few things. And so, yeah, different contexts and different geographic locations, right? The effects this has on positionality, power, and privilege, right? So, occupying stolen land, that's local and global. It's a relationship between land. Displacement, so living on a different on different land as a result of being a diaspora, let's just say. So this could be say Jews living outside their homeland, or the cultural and economic implications of this. Like I said, the global market systems, for example, and the historical legacies that are linked to land and linked to geography. So colonialism, most certainly. And then global and local positionality, right? What it means to be, you could say what it means to be white, let's just say on a global level versus at the local level, and actually how that changes, how that changes depending on your locality, right? Another thing I could mention here is actually the physical landscape being a source of racism as well. Like, for example, environmental racism. The destruction of the landscape actually can disproportionately affect racialized peoples. For example, the Flint water crisis, or um, mercury poisoning on First Nation reserves, or um, you know, pollution in India, and things like that. So here, just as some examples, how people can be implicated in the race construct around the world can be different. So being black in America versus being black in Africa can mean two different things. I saw a video once of a panel discussion in Whiteness, and there's a black professor talking about how he took a trip to Africa, and his experience of being black in Africa was different than being black in America. That the sort of racialization that he experiences in America, living in that dominant kind of world. Not that it's not dominant in Africa necessarily, but it's more that he didn't experience himself as the racial other in Africa the same way that he did in America. Instead, he experienced that his nationality had dominated his experience there, in the sense that um, he was actually experienced as privileged in some ways, and as a foreigner there, because of his identity as an American. That his blackness was, in a sense, kind of irrelevant, right? Whereas in America, it was totally not irrelevant, because um, in America, he's definitely a racial other, and racialized and seen as inferior there, even though he shares the same nationality as white Americans. So another example could be being white in America versus white in Germany, or white in China, or white in Finland, or all these different places that have different relationships to whiteness, right? And they might be subtle, or they might be more pronounced, but they're different nonetheless, right? So in America, there's a certain embodiment of a relationship to whiteness that is has its own history, right? And their own history in Germany, let's say with the Holocaust, or being white in China, where white people are a minority, right? Or being white in Finland, which has a relatively little relationship to developing racism and globalization. So the whole people's racial identity and racial positionality can differ based on context. And so this also means that there's complications in who is white, and also who is racialized, and who is colonized, and cultural and ethnic othering on local and global levels, and such. Um, and in regards to who is white, this actually is interesting, because it kind of connects to the geographical aspect of Europe, right? Because one marker of whiteness is a European identity, right? That's one aspect of being white. But ironically, Europe doesn't actually exist as a continent, right? The idea of Europe being a continent is actually it's a Eurocentric notion, because on geographically, Europe is a region of Asia, a region of Eurasia, more technically. It's not actually a continent, because it's not surrounded by water. There's no magic line that separates Europe from Asia. I mean, some people consider it the Ural Mountains, but that's that is kind of contradictory and problematic in itself. Some have drawn the line in Eastern Europe, some have drawn the line in the Middle East. The magic line doesn't really exist, right? So this whole geographical idea is constructed largely as well. And who's white and who's racialized and who's colonized and such. There's different relationships to that, and different implications of that in different parts of the world, inside Europe, outside Europe, between Europe and other places. So it gets quite complicated here. So moving on, the historical aspect of race is very important, or you could call it the historical to contemporary. So the relationship between past and present with racial history. So I've talked about historical legacies of colonization and globalization and uprooting of indigenous societies, and in this sense, you could say that the societal other in a certain way. slavery, genocide, cultural oppression, all those types of things which are rooted in historical events are living on today as historical legacies. And there's a certain inheritance that comes along with that. So social marginalization is one of those manifestations of historical legacies. So these events do not just exist frozen in time in the past. Social marginalization, for example, for Indigenous peoples in Canada, are a direct result of the Indian Act and of land theft and of cultural repression and these types of things. It's not a result of they're too lazy or there's something wrong with them or they're not biologically capable or culturally capable. No, there is a sociological or anthropological explanation for why this is. The same thing you could say about the Black community in the United States. Why is their crime rate higher? I hear with this whole Black Lives Matter protest going on, people say, "Oh, but they're criminals and blah blah blah." Well, that's actually just a stereotype, for one thing. But why is their crime rate higher? Their crime rate is higher, and all their social issues are higher because of social marginalization that stems from historical legacies, such as slavery. So this is what generates these predicaments today. Another thing could be intergenerational trauma. Now, this is important as well because it's the idea that peoples living today are literally inheriting the trauma that their ancestors went through and embodying it today, and experiencing a form of inequality today that is diffused through kinship. And so this could be descendants of slaves, like I say, who are not only experiencing social marginalization, but also various forms of intergenerational trauma on a cultural level as well. It could be descendants of the Holocaust. My own family has been disrupted by the Holocaust. They've been displaced, and we've lost some of our culture and some of our language and those types of things. Or it could be residential schools and the effect that that's had on the family structure, and the effect that that's had on parenting, and the effects that that's had on the community, right? Or it could even be in a very familial way, in the sense of having more dysfunctional family or having family estrangement and those types of things. I actually have some of that in my family, on my mother's side of the family, and it probably goes back to these historical events like land theft and colonization. And actually, in regards to intergenerational trauma, there's actually a biological component involved as well. There's new research emerging now about epigenetics, which is the idea that trauma changes gene expression that can be passed on to descendants. So more than just culturally and sociologically, it's actually biological as well. On the flip side, there's also inherited power. So this is the opposite to that, the idea of inheriting cultural power, social power, economic and political power. This could be wealth. This could be your culture being dominant. This could be a lot of things. But essentially, that white people and those who are privileged have a lot of inherited power. That is the result of historical legacies establishing their representation of them as a human being, as that is the norm, that is the standard, that is the default, that is inherited power. It's inheriting it from the past. It's as simple as that. In particular, one thing I wanted to mention was the whiteness of the ancestors, or the group who did the discovering or the colonizing or establishing the modern world, so to speak. For example, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are probably the principal embodiment of this, because their ancestors did these things, and they're embodying that history today. And that's even if they're poor, even if they're marginalized in some other way, they are still descendants of this, and there's still a certain inheritance and embodiment of that can never really be changed. And I wanted to say as well, global inequality as the result of globalization and colonization and inequality in an interconnected transnational way. So I'm not going to go into much depth here, but You should look up though world systems theory. It's a sociological theory of economics that posits that inequality around the world stems from historical establishments of global markets that are related to different parts of the world that have different levels of inherited power as a result. So the core is basically Western nations and including United States and Canada and such. The periphery would be kind of second world nations, and semi-periphery would be the most exploited, most racialized nations. So what this means is that not everyone is implicated the same way in the race construct because people have different histories. And this can mean, like I said before, not all people of color have the same historical legacies and don't have the same positionality. They're inheriting different things. Yeah, and so at the same time, this also means that different people socialized as white will have different relationships to whiteness in a historical way. And this can mean different forms of power being inherited, right? His whiteness always means inheriting some kind of power, but the exact form of power may be different for different groups in different contexts. So in certain contexts, whiteness lies to some people. In other contexts, it's honorary whiteness. It's whiteness with strings attached. And this is just more evidence to the constructionism of race and the fallacy of it and the power involved. And I'm not saying that white people don't have power or don't have privilege, but it's more how that privilege is inherited and the different forms that it takes. So the last layer here is that of indigeneity in society, which is another layer of racism that can add to one's racial experience and positionality. So indigeneity is linked to yet independent of racialization. So, in other words, being indigenous and being a person of color is not the same thing, and relationships of indigeneity to a dominant culture can even happen within non-white groups. So, for example, Japanese people are positioned as people of color, but the Ainu, who are indigenous to Japan, are indigenous people. So there's actually a power dynamic going on there, and arguably a racial dynamic on a global level as well, because Japan is embodying globalization. And also in this layer, whiteness is largely connected with being Western. In many ways it is, like I say, because of the history and the society and the culture of whiteness and all these things. And non-whiteness is other, basically. And so in the indigenous sense, looking at the Sami people who are indigenous to northern Scandinavia, in the physical sense, they may be white, right? They may appear white or pass as white or whatever. But in the other layers of racialization, they are most certainly not white and most certainly racialized and most certainly an other, definitely. And so in particular, they take on that indigeneity. And so, they can come to Canada, let's just say, and live a white experience here in that sense, but they're still indigenous people on a global level. And so, yeah, indigeneity exists in both local and global contexts. What does it mean to be indigenous on your territory versus indigenous in a global way, being indigenous person in a shared way around the world? So that would be like Sami and Inuit, for example, and the effect this has on positionality. So what does it mean to be indigenous on your own territory versus being indigenous somewhere else? Like, you could argue that you don't lose your indigeneity because you've left your territory, right? It just means you're on someone else's indigenous territory, right? So indigeneity, and this actually breaks down the idea again of indigenous versus settler. Like, if a Sami person comes to Blackfoot territory, they're still indigenous people. They're just living on different indigenous territory. Now, another way in which indigenous people face a particular form of racism is how they're affected by ethnocentrism. And again, ethnocentrism is a sort of building block of racism, but in this sense, indigenous people are often seen as the societal other, as goes back to progress and civilization, of being, they're not as developed as we are and all this kind of thing, that has has fueled racism against Indigenous people and has put them in their historical and contemporary predicaments. And they tend to have additional social marginalization, like I said in the previous slide, that comes from history, and it's because of the histories of genocide and histories of colonialism that, in particular, have affected Indigenous people, and other people of color may not experience. May not experience racism the same way as Indigenous peoples, because there is that added level of ethnocentrism there that may not apply to people of color in a more broad way, and the social marginalization may not apply to people of color in the more broad way as well. And another point as well is cultural erasure, and this is part of the social marginalization, that Indigenous peoples are particularly disposed to assimilation and cultural repression and such. And something else to mention is the erasure of indigeneity in the processes of slavery and displacement. So displacing Indigenous peoples from their territory has also caused for cultural erasure, not just the kind of direct repression, but also slavery. You know, Black people who are descendants of slaves were originally Indigenous people on Indigenous land who were displaced and removed from their land, and their whole identities were erased. So now that I've gone through all the major layers of racism, I put these questions here just because I've hoped that this discussion would stimulate some questioning of the existential questions. You know, what is racism? What is power? What is privilege? What are these things, and how do they exist in the world, right? So is racism just people in clan hoods who burn crosses and Nazis with swastikas in their foreheads? Or does it exist in a more complicated way? Does it take multiple forms? Does it exist on a global level? Is it rooted in history? Right? And same could be said for power. Is in what ways does power exist? In which ways do we inherit or not inherit power? In ways do we inherit or not inherit privilege? On what layers? In what ways? Right? So these are the types of questions. So what does this all mean? With all these things considered, in decolonization, when we are here to articulate ourselves and how we fit into these structures and what our positionalities are and everything else, we really have to ask, what components of whiteness, power, and privilege do I have or not have? So ask how, right? This isn't just, am I white? Am I not white? Am I privileged? And what, it's not really a yes or no question. Ask how. How do I fit into whiteness? How am I carrying or perpetuating power or privilege? In what ways, right? It's all about how we're doing this. The exact manifestations of power that we might be exercising, the kinds of privileges we've inherited. Not just do we have privilege, yes or no, but how so, right? And this is actually, in particular, it's important for mixed people and those of racial ambiguity. I've kind of mentioned this a few times throughout here. About how race isn't binary, but for those people who do live in the middle of that, it's especially important for them to evaluate their positionality, because it might not be straightforward and obvious, right? And so to ask the question, am I white or am I a person of color, it forces that same binary and assumes that there's rigidity there. And in some cases, it's fitting to pick one or the other, but the point of this is to see that there's so many components involved that on the overall level, right, there's different manifestations of power and privilege and whiteness and racialization. And so questions of, say, who's white, because we really do have to confront that question, because how do we decolonize whiteness if we can't name what whiteness is? We have to determine that. But asking who is white as if it's an ontologically real, as if there's a question that is ontologically real, a better question to ask is, how are we white, right? Are we white because we've inherited power? Are we white because we have the privilege of looking white? Are we white because of having our culture dominant, having ancestors who created whiteness, power over other cultures, or power over Indigenous people? How are we being white, right? In what ways? What types of things? Is it historically? Is it culturally? Is it linguistically? Physically? How so? Right? So if we don't ask these types of questions, there's the potential to obscure the decolonization process that each individual goes through. That's different for each person and different for their respective groups, right? That if we don't have a nuanced approach, then it makes decolonization cookie cutter and says, okay, all white people do the same thing, all people of color do the same thing, all indigenous people do the same thing, and it just isn't that simple. And furthermore, this also goes to racism as well. If we talk about how we're being racist, right? To ask the question, am I or is somebody else racist, is not a very helpful question, really, because it's not a yes or no, right? There's no binary between are you yes or no racist. Ask how, right? Ask to what extent, on what level, in what ways. Is it because of hereditary privilege, because you've inherited privilege or inherited power? Is it on the individual collective level? In what ways? Is it the individual level of having preconceived notions or biases or those things? Is it unconscious attitudes, racist or ethnocentric attitudes? Is it participating in the racist society? Is it participating in decolonization work or anti-racism? Like how does that affect your how we're racist? Like it's complex, right? It's not just yes or no, and it's not just the extremes either. Of, like I said before, it's not just neo-Nazis and such. Racism can be very subtle as well, and also racism can be, because it's so deeply conditioned. Whether we can fully rid that conditioning is an important question as well. And so lastly, never assume someone's overall position or overall placement in the race structure, because the whole point of this presentation has been to discuss how race is multifaceted, multidimensional. And taking one of those components and assuming someone's position based on that one component is just erroneous, right? And the point here is to avoid doing that, because it may mischaracterize them and the power and privilege or racialization they may or may not have, right? Because it's not always obvious when looking at just one component. You have to examine all of the components. And that's why I say, as the title question here, what components do I have? So to conclude everything here, race is full of nuance. Now that should be a major point here, that understanding all these different layers is seeing that race is full of complication, right? It's full of complexity. There's no simplistic way to understand it. And then we have to use nuance if we're going to understand race, if we're going to involve ourselves in anti-racism and such. It won't be meaningful if we don't understand it in a nuanced way. And we also have to understand race as a construct and as a structure, as a spectrum. Okay, this is in contrast to it being a binary. We have to understand it as a spectrum with so many different points along that spectrum that can intersect with each other and overlap, and there's different dimensions along it as well, and different dimensions of power and privilege and inequality and everything else that fits into this complex structure that is race. Okay, it's never simplistic, and that no single component alone can adequately encompass everything about race. Okay, we can't say it's just about that physical layer, or just about that geographic layer, or just the cultural layer, or any of those things. We have to see those things assembled together as a whole. So in decolonization and anti-racism, we have to understand that with this kind of complexity in mind. We have to do our decolonization work and involve ourselves in anti-racist discourses or what have you, with the understanding that race has this kind of complexity with it, that each individual has their own circumstances, right? That we understand race takes all these different forms, and that we all have different ways to understand ourselves and understand our own position in the race structure, and our own ways of addressing it as well, right? Not everyone has the same decolonization work to do, and that's a major point of decolonization, that it's not the same for everyone, and there's no one size fits all for this. We cannot pigeonhole people into groups and say, well, you're white, so you do this exactly the same way that every other white person does, and you're a person of color and do this exact same way every other person of color does. Each person has their own unique set of circumstances, really, and so we all have to develop unique ways to go about decolonization in our own ways. So this concludes my presentation. I hope it was useful to you and hopefully gave you some new ways to understand race. I'll probably be producing more content on this subject in the future, so stay tuned, and until next time.